I'm going to talk about what implicit motives are, and I'm not going to talk about a specific definition of what they are, but I'm really going to focus on the conceptual question of what implicit motives are. So are they internal states or are they patterns? Well, those are the two options I will discuss, and I will argue that they are patterns. And at first I thought that might sound a bit weird for psychologists, but I think in the end what I'm going to argue for is very much in line with the talks we heard today, especially the one by Professor Lane, but we'll see what happens. So my idea is that if you look at, that's not going to work. So if you look at this iceberg, that's the common picture we have of the implicit self. So there's the idea that some parts of our states and perhaps feelings, what we talked about, or beliefs are below the surface. We do not really have access to them. And that's the view I'm going to challenge, because I think part of this view might be due to the fact that we have a tendency to think that for something to be real, to really exist, it has to be a state or some sort of object. It cannot just be a pattern or a theoretical concept that we use in psychological theories. And my aim is to argue against that tendency and to say, well, even though implicit motives might not be internal states that cause certain things, they still are real and they still play an important role in understanding and predicting and explaining what people will do. So, that's the general gist of the talk. So let's just first say something more about what motives actually are. So one important thing I should add to this is that I'm not going to talk about implicit biases or implicit feelings, but I'm really going to focus on those implicit motives that are central in McClelland's work. So he makes a distinction between the power motive, the affiliation motive, and the achievement motive, among others. And I will use the power motive throughout this talk to make my point. Motives are defined in that literature as a relatively enduring preference for a broadly defined class of effective charged incentives or a recurrent concern for a goal state. So what does that exactly mean? Well, it means that someone who has the power motive is, when that person is in a certain situation, he will quickly recognize incentives or possibilities for having an impact on others or on their environment. And that's often also the goal of what they do, or more perhaps than others, they tend to recognize and aim for the goal of in fact having an impact. So just to show you that in this line of talking about it, which is clear in McClelland's book, but I think also in other papers that are concerned with this topic of implicit motives and explicit motives for that matter, the general idea is that there is this motive that concern or preference, that is some sort of internal state, that has to be triggered by motivational situational demands. So for example, incentives, situations in which you could have an impact on others, and certain temporary situations in which that might be the case. So for example, when you play a tennis match or play a game with someone, you have a tendency to want to win that and to want to go into discussions with people and things like that. And the thought is that these situational motivational factors trigger this motive, and after that this motive leads to certain feelings and thoughts and actions. So that's the picture that I think is at least implicit and in some senses more explicit present in the work by McClelland and also in related literature. So that looks something like this. We have the environment, we have an internal state which is a concern or a preference for having an impact, and then we have thoughts and feelings and actions that express this concern or preference. So the general idea is that motives energize. So motives cause certain thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and actions. And this is the picture that I would challenge in this talk. But first, I want to say a bit more about well, the different kind of motives there are and how they are in fact measured, because it's very interesting. If you read McClelland's book, that he says, well, if we really want to know what motivates people, we should be careful not to look at what they're actually doing. So if we only look at what they're doing and then reason back to a cause, then we're committing the naming fallacy, as he says it. So we could see someone studying hard, but we should not reason back from that to saying that this person has the motive to study hard, because that's just reasoning back from something you see and you don't really know whether that motive is really there. And this is more or less the line of thinking that I'm going to argue for in this talk. So it's really this going from, but he really focuses on what people do, but my claim will be also in the case of thoughts and feelings, we have no good reason to reason back from these to some sort of internal state that causes these. And one other point that McClelland makes, if you only look at what people do, is that you will miss some motives, because some people may have the power motive but may never be in a situation in which they can really express it. They may lack the opportunity or they may lack the skills. So we cannot really know what motives a person has just by looking at what the output is, so to say. So then McClelland more or less quickly rejects the idea that we could ask people what motivates them. So he tends to be critical about this approach. And that is because he, well, assumes from the start, but at least he thinks it's clear from the start that we do not have full access to what actually motivates us. So there's always things that we're not aware of and that we might not report because of social desirability. So if we just ask people what motivates them, we will have a very limited, limited information about their motives. So then we end up with a different way to assess motives, which would be to find out about them indirectly. So you're not asking people what motivates them, but you try to trigger situations in which certain fantasies and thoughts and feelings are aroused, and these can best be done, this can best be done according to people in the field by presenting people with pictures, which was also talked about by Professor Keir, and seeing how they respond to certain questions, which stories they create. And since it seems that the answers people give to these questionnaires, so their self-attributed motives, tend to paint the very, or at least can explain things about what we will do that are different from these implicit motives. The idea is that there are in fact two types of motives. So you have these self-attributed or explicit motives, which predict the goals you have in a shorter term, and you have implicit motive, which predicts longer-term behavioral trends. So the idea is there are two types of motives. And I, in this talk, will focus on the implicit motives. So I think also if you look at how these implicit motives are measured and the reasoning surrounding this measurement, you see this idea that the implicit motive is some sort of deeply buried state that you cannot be introspectively aware of. So the idea is that you can only measure implicit motives indirectly. So we don't have access to them. That's the general idea. So you trigger, you present people with pictures, and well, I just put in some different projective tests that have been used to measure these implicit motives. But the idea is you present people with pictures and they respond in a certain way by expressing certain thoughts and fantasies and feelings in the stories they create or the answers they give. So, and the general idea is we cannot access the implicit motive directly, and we do not really know the origin of our emotions and behaviors. So the only thing we can do is measure them indirectly by letting people create stories about other people in pictures. So I already emphasized that this would be option 1, and this is the option that is present in the literature either implicitly or, well, not very explicitly in general. And so the idea is that the implicit motive is the internal state. So there is an internal cause, and that is the implicit motive. And that would imply that we can only measure the implicit motive indirectly, because the implicit motive itself is shielded off from both the researcher and the person who has the implicit motive. So my aim is to argue for a different option, so option 2. And option 2 would be that a person has an implicit motive if there's a pattern in responding, thinking and feeling which corresponds to the folk psychological concept, a concern for having an impact. And this might sound a bit shaky maybe, but, or at least you might think, well, doesn't this imply that the implicit motive is not something real and that we cannot really use it in psychological theory? Well, I think that's not the case, because what I think is the general story here is that you really see, if you look at the literature on this topic, that there are a lot of different examples. So you have the desire to win a tennis match, the tendency to be more aggressive, thinking about your reputation, worrying about that, and a tendency to spread rumors, things like that all pop up in the literature. And my idea would be that there's not some sort of common cause underlying all these different thoughts and feelings. It's rather the case that people display different aspects of what we think the implicit power motive is to a different extent and over a longer period of time. And on the basis of that, we come up with a more or less decision whether someone has the implicit power motive or not. And that's precisely how we are doing it now in psychology. So we are triggering these kinds of thoughts and feelings, and that is what we are measuring. So that would look like this. So that would mean that we in fact measure the implicit motive directly, because there's not some underlying state. The implicit power motive is, a theoretical concept, a concept we use to predict and to explain what people will do, but it's not some sort of underlying state that causes all these different feelings and thoughts. What would connect all these different things together is our stereotypical concept of a person who wants to have an impact, and the feelings and thoughts that go with being such a person. So, since it's really a conceptual point, so it's not, I think, something we can empirically establish or, empirically establish. So the question really is, what would be arguments for either saying that the implicit motive is an internal state that causes certain things, or my view that implicit motives, like the power motive, are patterns. And one important point would be that we in general have a tendency, or that I already pointed out a little bit in psychology, to, or not only in psychology, people in general have this tendency, I think, that we see certain patterns or we see certain processes and we are tempted to think that a certain characteristic or a certain aspect of that process precedes this process or pattern, so that there is some sort of cause. So we are tempted to think that if we see something occurring, there must be some sort of object that causes it. So that's exactly what McClelland pointed out, that we see someone studying hard and that we assume that there must be a goal of studying hard before that. But actually we have no good reason to do so. And mainly because we don't have to think that something only really exists if it's an object. So this has been pointed out by a lot of philosophers like Wittgenstein and Whitehead and Dewey, and also by William James, and also more or less by Gilbert Ryle. So Gilbert Ryle has the interesting example of well, making clear that some things are just patterns and not, or in his few dispositions, but I think it's very much related to what I want to say. So he gives the example of someone taking a tour on a university campus. So they walk around there and someone explains to him, well, that's the physics building and that's where the psychologists are and here is the sports center. And then this person asks, all right, but now where is the university? And we all realize that that's a category mistake. The university is not an object. It's not something you can point at. It's an organization of buildings and of students being there and of professors doing research and other people doing research. And all these aspects play some role, and you could take away a certain aspect of a university and you would still say, well, it's a university, but if you take away too much, it's no longer a university. But that's a gradual, we don't have a clear one thing that needs to be there. And we should not conclude from this that the university doesn't exist. It's just not something that can be pointed out as some specific object. And what then in this case of psychology the next step would be, and which I think you see sometimes in also in reductionist views of mental disorders or maybe personality states, is that you make this object to be some sort of prior state and a cause of this process or pattern. So some examples would be, for example, ADHD, in which the tendency has been, on the one hand, to say, well, we need to know whether it's real, so we are going to look in the brain whether there is some cause that is ADHD and that causes all the other symptoms. And on the other hand, the move is to say, well, it doesn't really exist because we cannot really point out some sort of object that is ADHD. But in fact, if you look at how we use ADHD and how it is diagnosed, it is really this pattern. So people, there's not even one specific necessary behavior or thought or feeling. Two factors are hyperactivity and impulsivity, and both have been subdivided in 9 different aspects, and you need to have 6 of 9 for both for a longer period of time. So we really see it as something, a pattern that exists in the world and that we use to, explain what people will do and to diagnose them and to help them. But we should not think that we have to wait to find a common cause before we're sure that it exists, because ADHD is just this pattern in responding to certain things. And I'm not denying that we may find common brain activity or common parts of the brain being connected to ADHD, but my point is that we already know and we already established that a person has ADHD, and what we look for in the brain is how it exactly functions, for example, or maybe find out what kind of relationships there are between different aspects of ADHD. But it's not the case that we are not sure that ADHD exists and then look in the brain. It's the other way around. We start off with this folk psychological or this psychological concept and then look what kind of causes there are and what kind of brain activity is involved. And yeah, I think that's a really important distinction, to make the distinction between the concept, what ADHD is, and what brain states play a functional role and what may cause it. But I think those things should be kept apart. And a similar example would be personality states. So also in the case of personality states, you really see that there's a pattern in the world, that a person tends to go to parties less, likes to read books, likes to sit alone, doesn't always need to meet people. But if you take out one of those aspects, you would still say that that person is introverted. It's really this pattern of having certain thoughts and feelings and behaviors. And again, we have no reason to move from this psychological concept to some sort of cause of this psychological concept. There just is this pattern, and what's common about it is that it's, it fits in with our view of what introverted people are, or stereotype, and it functions in a well-functioning theory, so we can use it to explain and predict what people will do, and therefore introversion exists. So that's, I think, the line of reasoning we can also take when it comes to implicit motives. So again, if we look at implicit motives, the starting point is a folk psychological concept. So the starting point is, actually, McClelland is very open and clear about this, that the starting point is the intuitions of the researcher, and that's, of course, what happens when you start to construct a questionnaire, or when you start to make this picture test. You have this intuition about what wanting to have an impact means, what's part of it and what's not. And that is the starting point. And yeah, my point would be there's no good ground to reason back from this pattern and these different aspects of what wanting to have an impact is. We already know what it is because we have this stereotype, and it is made up of different elements, and some elements are more important than others, and some elements may need to be there for a longer time, but these that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that there has to be a previous cause. Yeah, so the hidden state doesn't make it real. And another reason, I think, to say that the implicit motive is not some sort of state between these, that's quite clear, between these situational, motivational factors and these thoughts and feelings, and that is because if we look at how we talk about what motivates us, we don't say what motivates me is a concern for having an impact. What motivates me is having an impact, or a desire to win, or having the goal to have an impact, or being in a situation in which, these different aspects of this pattern are relevant. So if you look at this picture, so on the, there, maybe? No, okay. So on the one hand, you have these situational motivational factors, and then McClelland puts in the motive dispositions, or, well, he's not really clear about what he means by something being a disposition. And then we have the aroused motivation, but we can do without this motive disposition in how we talk about what motivates us and what we in fact do. So my proposal would be, when we talk about what motivates a person, we don't talk about a motive, we talk about states in the world, and we talk about our desires, and we talk about our goals. We don't talk about having a preference for something. And I think a similar case can be made for ADHD and for introversion. So even though sometimes we say, this person has a problem with focusing because he has ADHD, we don't mean that ADHD causes this. We mean to say, well, this is a way to explain why it's hard for him to focus, and then teachers understand. Then they may give him more space or adapt certain things. And the same holds for introversion. So what motivates a person to stay home is the desire to stay home, or the desire to read a book, or any other situation, or maybe what motivates an introverted person not to go in a certain career is that then the person has to present, things like that. So these are situational motivational factors or psychological states, and those motivate us, not being introverted itself. And yeah, I could give some, so I think another interesting example would be jealousy. You're not motivated by jealousy, you're motivated by a situation in which you're jealous at someone, so you're motivated by a person having something that you want, and that motivates you, or that leads to certain feelings, and that motivates you to certain behaviors. So my point would be that we don't need this implicit motive as an intermediate cause. We can already explain or give a causal explanation of what's going on and what motivates us without saying that the motive itself energizes us. And well, one question might be that you might wonder, well, then how and why do parts of the pattern in fact hang together if they're just a stereotype and if they don't really have a common cause? Well, I think one reason for that would be that we in general are to some extent coherent people, so in general we have beliefs that cohere with each other and we have desires that more or less cohere with each other. And if we don't, we try to adapt them and feelings and thoughts. So that would explain that situations in which we can have an impact, or we can win a game, or we can explain things to people, we like all those situations because they involve similar beliefs and desires. And on the other hand, I think this view can also explain why the internal consistency of the projective tests that I was talking about, so this picture story test and things like that, why the internal consistency is low. So implicit motives predict certain behavioral trends, but in general there are low, like the answers they give to different pictures seem to diverge. So, or at least they don't cohere as much with each other, or they don't correlate as much with each other as other questions on other questionnaires do. And that would actually be in line with the thought that implicit motives are patterns, because in fact there are different ways to be a person with the implicit power motive. So there are different ways to be such a person. So maybe you don't find it that important to win at some stupid game or a game of tennis, but you do find it important to be very successful at work, or to have a good reputation, or things like that. And another person might find winning at games more important, but both these people have, to some extent, the implicit power motive. And it makes sense that you would still say the person has the implicit power motive, but it just is reflected in a very different way in the answers they give to these questions. So I think this would actually be in line with the empirical findings on what implicit motives are and how they are measured. So this does have the implication, of course, that motives don't energize, direct, and select behavior, as McClelland suggests. But as I explained, I don't think that this leads to the conclusion that implicit motives are not real, or that they don't play any interesting role in psychology, because we still can explain what people will do and predict what people will do on the basis of measuring this implicit motive or scoring people on this implicit power motive. So, what makes it real is that it functions in a theory that does in a psychological theory that does a good job at predicting and explaining what people will do. And we don't need there to be some sort of underlying cause. So this is the point that I already made. So then another implication would be that we have to think about what exactly is implicit if we talk about implicit motives. So it cannot be the case that there is this deep underlying state that we cannot access, because there is none. There's only this pattern, at least on this view. But I think, it's my suggestion would be very much in line with Professor Lane was talking about. So one way in which you can be unaware of the implicit motive is that you don't realize that your desire to win at games and that your tendency to always decide where you're going to go for dinner and that you care about your reputation, that they can all be understood as part of a power motive, and that they say something about you, namely that you care about having an impact, and that being such a person may make you more suitable for certain jobs than for others, for example. So you're not aware that your actions and your feelings and thoughts can be described as having the power motive. So in that sense, it is implicit because, and of course we can give all kinds of descriptions which then would be implicit, but this is an interesting description because it functions in a psychological theory that can explain and predict people. So you could explain and predict yourself better if you understand that patterns in your life can be understood as the power motive. And a different way in which the motive might be implicit is that you end up having feelings and thoughts and that you're not aware what exactly made you feel and think that way. So you might suddenly be angry or suddenly have depressive thoughts or things like that. And what's implicit in this case would be that you're not aware what situational factor triggered this for you. So you might not be aware of where your responses precisely come from. So in these ways, the implicit motive could still be implicit. And you could well become aware of it, because you could read about these different kinds of motives and realize that you really have a tendency to want to have an impact on others, for example. And you could think, well, maybe I should get a different job, or maybe I'm perfect at the job that I'm at, things like that. So in that sense, it would still be in line with a lot of things that we talked about today. So yeah, my conclusions would be that whether a person has a certain implicit motive does not depend on there being a hidden internal state, but to what extent a stereotypical pattern in her thoughts and feelings can be recognized. That's in line with what we think a person who wants to have an impact should have to some extent. And on this picture, implicit motives do not energize, direct, and select what we do. Rather, the situation, our desires, and our goals energize and direct what we do. And the motive is a redescription of this situation, and not just a redescription, but a redescription that functions in a psychological theory. And that brings me to the last point, that the conclusion would not be that they do not exist or that they don't have any function, because they still play a very important role in explaining and predicting what people will do, at least if they're part of a successful theory. So that was what I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention.